The flatbed truck came every Tuesday morning without fail, rumbling down the gravel road before the rest of Clover Ridge had finished their first cup of coffee. Its diesel engine announced itself half a mile away, a low mechanical growl that vibrated through the floorboards of the Harper farmhouse and rattled the single-frame photograph sitting on the kitchen windowsill. In that photograph, a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes held a young boy on her lap, both of them squinting into summer sunlight. Neither of them knew on the day that picture was taken how few summers remained. Caleb Hurst was already outside when the truck appeared at the end of the lane. He stood at the edge of the property wearing a faded canvas jacket, 2 sizes too large, inherited from a father who rarely threw anything away. His dark brown hair fell across his forehead in the same stubborn way it always had, and his hazel eyes tracked the approaching truck with an expression that most people mistook for indifference. It was not indifference. It was concentration of a particular kind, the sort that belongs to people who have learned to extract meaning from things others consider finished. Gus Tanner eased the flatbed through the gap in the fence posts and back toward the far corner of the property with the practiced ease of a man who had performed this maneuver more times than he could count. Gus was 62 years old, broad across the shoulders, despite 3 decades of sitting behind a wheel with silver hair tucked beneath a faded blue cap and deep laugh lines carved permanently into the skin around his eyes. He climbed down from the cab without hurry. That was the thing about Gus. Nothing he did suggested urgency. The world moved at whatever pace it chose, and Gus Tanner moved alongside it without complaint. The hydraulic lift groaned. Maple sections, walnut blocks, twisted oak lengths, and one enormous piece of flame-patterned maple that had split along its center. During milling, all of it slid off the trailer and landed in the field with heavy, satisfying thuds that sent birds scattering from the tree line. To Blue Ridge Timber Company, these were liabilities. Storage space consumed by material that failed commercial grading standards. Warped trunks, eccentric grain patterns, hidden tension that made predictable cutting impossible. The arrangement with Raymond Hurst was straightforward. The company avoided disposal fees, Raymond received no payment, and the land absorbed what the mill could not use. Gus lifted 2 fingers toward Caleb in the casual salute he always offered, climbed back into the cab and eased the truck back down the gravel road. He had never once asked what happened to the wood after he left. In 30 years of hauling timber across western North Carolina, Gus Tanner had learned that most things were simpler when you didn't ask too many questions. Across the road, a screen door opened. Everett Pruitt stepped onto his porch in the particular way of a man who has appointed himself the unofficial observer of everything that happens on his street. He was 71 years old, retired from a hardware supply business he had sold 15 years earlier, and he possessed the unshakable confidence of someone who had never once been wrong about anything, at least not in his own accounting. He hooked his thumbs into the pockets of his work pants and studied the fresh pile of timber with visible disapproval. More firewood for the next 100 years, his voice carried across the road without effort. Boy, your daddy know how much of that stuff is piling up back there. Caleb looked at the new maple block. Its surface was rough dark with bark still attached along one side, split cleanly down its length to reveal a swirling interior grain that caught the morning light in a way that made something shift quietly in his chest. He placed his palm flat against the exposed wood. The grain moved in long, sweeping curves like muscle memory frozen in timber. Morning, Mr. Pruitt. He didn't look up. Everett shook his head with the slow certainty of a man delivering a verdict. Collecting junk, he muttered and went back inside. Caleb crouched beside the maple block and studied it the way other boys his age studied playbooks or phone screens. His fingertips traced the split edge where the grain changed direction, curving inward toward what had once been the heartwood of a tree that took decades to grow and approximately 4 seconds to be deemed commercially useless. Most people looking at this block saw the end of something. Caleb saw the beginning of a problem he had not yet solved, which was the closest thing he knew to happiness. He was 15 years old. His hands were rough in ways that most boys his age would find strange, covered in the particular calluses and small white scars that accumulate only through years of working sharp tools against resistant materials. He had begun carving at 12 after his mother died, using a pocket knife his grandfather had left behind in a fallen oak branch from the property's edge. The first thing he made was a bird. It looked nothing like a bird. He kept it anyway. Eleanor Hurst had died on a Wednesday in early March, 3 years before the morning Caleb stood in the field studying that maple block. She had been diagnosed 14 months earlier, and the family had spent those months doing what families do. In such circumstances, rearranging the ordinary details of life around something extraordinary and terrible that was happening at the center of it. Caleb had been 12, old enough to understand everything, young enough that understanding it did not provide the slightest protection against it. What grief did to Caleb was not what it does to most people. It did not make him loud or angry or desperate for distraction. It made him quiet in a way that went deeper than personality, a quietness that had substance to it like the dense interior of hardwood, rather than the hollow sound of particle board. He stopped talking as much. He started making things. The connection between those two facts was something he had never examined directly, but it was real. The way grain direction is real even when you can't see it from the surface. Raymond Hurst noticed. He noticed in the way of fathers who are not naturally demonstrative, which is to say he noticed without saying much about it. Raymond was 46, broad-shouldered from years of maintenance work that required moving heavy things through inconvenient spaces, with close-cropped hair gone mostly gray at the temples and a beard that made him look sterner than he was. His hands were scarred in ways that had nothing to do with artistry and everything to do with machinery that didn't care about the people operating it. He worked long shifts and came home tired in a way that had become structural rather than temporary, the kind of tired that settles into a person's posture over years. But every morning before work, Raymond made breakfast. Not because he was a gifted cook, because breakfast was a thing he could do reliably, a small proof that the household was still functioning, still organized around the basic requirements of a 15-year-old boy who needed to eat before school. On the kitchen table beside the salt shaker, he left whatever woodworking magazines he found at thrift stores and estate sales, grainy photographs of joinery techniques, profiles of craftsmen working in traditional methods, patterns, and grain charts. He himself couldn't read, but suspected his son could. He never mentioned them. Caleb never mentioned them either. They simply appeared and disappeared, absorbed into whatever project was currently developing inside the old barn. The barn sat at the back of the property, tilted slightly to the east from decades of Appalachian winters working against its foundation. Its red paint faded to a dusty rose that turned almost beautiful in late afternoon light. One of the window frames had rotted and been covered with plastic sheeting that Raymond replaced each spring. The floor was uneven. The overhead beam had a crack that Caleb had reinforced with a bolt and a steel bracket he found in the maintenance shed. A single work light hung from a hook in the ceiling. The workbench occupied the center of the space, scarred with cut marks and stained with linseed oil and wood dye, solid as the day it was built from scrap timber by someone who had owned the property before the Hursts and whose name nobody remembered. This was where Caleb spent his afternoons. Not all of them homework came first, a rule that Raymond enforced with quiet consistency, but every hour after homework was finished belonged to the barn. He kept a library card in his jacket pocket and used it more than most adults use theirs, checking out every book on woodworking the branch carried, then requesting through interlibrary loan the ones they didn't have. Late at night after Raymond had gone to bed, he watched technique videos on a tablet propped against the workbench, pausing and rewinding the same 10-second clips dozens of times until he could reproduce the motion with his own hands. He had never taken a class. He had never attended a workshop. He had never met a professional woodcarver in person. Everything he knew had been assembled from library shelves, free online resources, and the accumulated evidence of his own failures, which he kept on a shelf above the workbench rather than discarding. That shelf was important. It held every piece he had abandoned or broken or simply finished badly. A lopsided eagle from his first year, a wolf whose proportions had gone wrong somewhere in the hindquarters, a medieval knight whose sword had snapped during the final stages of carving and been replaced with a shortened version that looked, if you were honest about it, more like a butter knife. These failures were not decorations. They were a record, evidence that certain mistakes had already been made and need not be made again. The first truly ambitious piece had been a dragon. He had imagined sweeping wings and curled horns and thousands of overlapping scales across the body. The finished sculpture had a broken neck, one wing that had split when hidden tension in the maple released without warning, and a posture that suggested the creature had died attempting to stand up. He kept it. It went on the shelf beside the butter knife knight. The second dragon was better. The third was the first thing he made that someone who knew nothing about wood carving would look at and immediately understand to be a dragon, rather than a cautionary tale about hubris. By the time the Tuesday deliveries from Blue Ridge Timber began appearing behind the barn, Caleb had been carving for 3 years. His bedroom shelves, which had once held the ordinary archaeology of childhood action figures, model kits, a basketball trophy from the 1 year he played on a team, now held wooden creatures of increasing complexity. An eagle with individually textured feathers, a wolf in mid-stride whose back leg had required 4 attempts to carve without cracking, a spider perched on a small wooden branch, every segment of its body carved from a single piece of cherry wood, its legs tapering to points so fine they were technically unsound, but had survived anyway through some combination of careful technique and the particular stubbornness of cherry. He watched films the way other people watch films, which is to say he experienced them, was moved by them, cared about the characters. But the part of his mind that never entirely switched off was always cataloging. The way Venom's body seemed to exist in a state of controlled collapse muscles suggesting impossible tension. The way the Hulk's posture communicated rage not through facial expression alone, but through every line of the body, from the way the spine curved to the way the fists hung. These were problems of form of mass and direction, and implied movement, and they interested him at a level below articulation, the level where understanding lives before it becomes language. The walnut block that became Venom was 3 feet tall and nearly black when he found it in the pile, its surface so dense it resisted the first pass of his draw knife in a way that maple never did. Walnut had always felt serious to him. It didn't forgive careless cuts the way softer wood sometimes could. Every decision stayed in the material. He spent 11 evenings just studying the block before he touched it with a carving tool. Sketching, reconsidering, walking around it in the barn's yellow worklight, crouching to look at the grain from different angles, pressing his palm flat against it, and closing his eyes to feel the subtle difference in density between sections. When he finally began roughing out the form, the work went more quickly than any previous project because he had already made most of the decisions before the chisel touched the wood. 39 hours of carving across 17 evenings. The head took shape first, and it was good, better than anything he had finished before, the grain of the walnut running exactly where he needed it to create the illusion of movement in what was technically a static material. The teeth were the hardest technical challenge he had faced. He needed to carve dozens of individual points close enough together that they formed a coherent mass without any single tooth snapping during the process. He broke 3. He kept working. Then, on the 40th hour, with the sculpture nearly finished, he made the cut to complete the tongue. It cracked at the base. A clean fracture, the kind that happens not because of poor technique, but because of a stress point in the material that no amount of surface inspection can predict. The tongue, which had taken 4 hours to carve to exactly the shape he wanted, separated from the lower jaw and fell onto the workbench. Caleb sat on his stool for a long time. The barn was very quiet. Outside, a late summer wind moved through the property's edge trees, and somewhere down the road a neighbor's dog was making its feelings known about something. Inside the barn, there was only the worklight's steady hum and the particular silence of a project that had just failed in its final moments. He picked up the broken tongue. He turned it over in his hands. He set it back against the sculpture, pressing it into place, and looked at the hole. Something registered. The break had not been clean at the base. The fracture line curved slightly to the right, and where it had separated from the jaw, the wood showed a raw interior grain that was several shades lighter than the finished surface. It looked in the direct light of the work lamp like a wound, like something living. He sat with that observation for 20 minutes. Then he picked up a narrow chisel and began reshaping the jaw around the fracture rather than attempting to repair it. The tongue would not be replaced. The mouth would be redesigned to make the break feel intentional, more intentional, in fact, than the original design had been. When he finished 2 hours later, the expression on Venom's face was something that the original design had not achieved. It looked like the moment just before something terrible happens. The broken tongue, reshaped and contextualized, was the reason. He stood back from the workbench. He understood something that he would not be able to put into words for years. The mistake had not interrupted the sculpture. The mistake had become the sculpture's best decision. The shelf of failures began to look different after that evening. Not like evidence of inadequacy, like a curriculum. The maple block that became Hulk required him to solve different problems. He needed mass without stiffness, the suggestion of arrested motion in a material that was inherently static. He worked the grain so that it ran vertically through the torso, giving the finished surface a visual texture that read as muscle, even though it was technically the natural structure of the wood. The fist took 3 separate attempts. The third version was correct. Spider-Man came from a section of ash that had a natural forward curve to it, as though the tree itself had been leaning into something before it was cut. He designed the figure around that curve, letting the material's own inclination become the character's posture. The result looked like someone mid-swing about to release a web line and commit fully to the momentum of moving through the air. It was, he thought privately, the best thing he had made so far. The Iron Man helmet was different in character from everything else on the shelf. Where the other sculptures had organic qualities, surfaces that suggested life and movement, the helmet demanded precision. Clean lines, consistent curves. He used a walnut section with unusually straight fine grain, working it with sandpaper through increasingly fine grits until the surface caught light the way brushed metal does. The eyepieces were the problem he was most proud of solving. Achieved with a curved gouge drawn across the surface at a precise angle, creating the slight concavity that made them read as illuminated rather than simply painted. Each sculpture taught him something the previous one hadn't. He was not aware of this as a system. He was simply working following the grain and the form-solving problems as they appeared. But the learning was accumulating in his hands, even when it wasn't fully present in his mind, the way any practice does when you commit to it across thousands of hours. The barn was 3/4 full of finished and in-progress sculptures when Miles Drummond turned his pickup truck onto the Hearst property on a weekday afternoon in early September. Caleb was inside the barn working on a rough block he hadn't yet committed to a form, feeling the grain with his eyes closed when he heard tires on gravel. He set the block down and came to the barn door. Miles Drummond was 51 years old, tall and spare with neatly trimmed gray hair and sharp blue eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had spent decades looking at things carefully before speaking about them. He had restored historic homes throughout western North Carolina for nearly 25 years, which meant he had spent more time than most people examining the way old materials deteriorate and endure. The difference between wood that has been maintained and wood that has been neglected, the precise point at which a structure becomes unsalvageable versus the point at which it merely looks that way. He carried himself without hurry the way people do when they have learned through experience that rushing is almost always counterproductive. He had come to inspect the hardwood pile. Blue Ridge Timber had mentioned the arrangement to him when he'd called looking for reclaimed material for a restoration project, and he was looking for specific widths of white oak that the company couldn't supply from regular stock. He spent several minutes examining the pile, crouching to check the ends of oak sections for checking and ring separation, running a moisture meter along several surfaces, making small notes in a spiral notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. He was thorough and efficient and entirely absorbed in what he was doing, the way skilled people are when they're operating in their area of knowledge. It was only when he walked back toward his truck that he noticed the barn door standing open. He stopped. He looked through the gap. The work light was on. On every surface, the shelves, the workbench, the floor along the walls, wooden figures occupied the space in what appeared from the doorway to be an impossible density of detail for a single workshop. Miles Drummond crossed the threshold without asking permission, which was the only thing he did without asking permission. He stood just inside the door and turned slowly, taking in the full perimeter of the barn. The eagle, the wolf, the butter-knife knight, Spider-Man frozen mid-swing, the Hulk with its arrested momentum, Iron Man's helmet catching the work light, the 3 dragon iterations, each one more complex than the last, arranged in the order they had been made. He did not speak for a considerable time. When Caleb came up behind him, Miles didn't startle. He simply turned and looked at the boy, then looked back at the nearest sculpture, the venom head on its separate stand, the reformed jaw with its changed tongue. "You made all of these?" It was not quite a question. Caleb nodded. Miles walked to the hulk. He crouched down and looked at it from below the angle that revealed how the grain had been oriented through the torso. He stood up. He walked to Spider-Man. He looked at the curve of the ash and the way the figure's posture existed in relationship to that curve rather than despite it. Why did you choose this grain direction for the shoulders? His voice was level, informational, the tone of someone gathering data. The shoulders. On this one, why vertical instead of following the swing? Caleb looked at the sculpture. He had not at the time of making the decision thought of it in those terms. But now standing with the question in the room, he understood that he had made a choice, that the choice had been deliberate, even if its deliberateness had been instinctive rather than articulate. Because vertical grain in the shoulders makes it feel like the weight is pulling down, he said, slowly working it out as he spoke. If I followed the swing with the grain, the shoulders would look light, like the whole thing might float away. The vertical grain keeps it grounded even when the body is moving forward. Miles looked at the sculpture for another long moment. He nodded once, the small, precise nod of someone filing information correctly. He spent 40 minutes in the barn. He asked 11 questions, and every question required Caleb to do something he had never done before, explain a decision he had made with his hands in language his mind could organize. It was harder than carving. It required a different kind of attention, the kind that looks at something already completed and traces backward to the reasoning that produced it. Caleb found that the reasoning was there. He had not known it was there until Miles asked. When Miles finally turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. He looked back at the barn with the expression of someone recalculating something. People need to see these. Caleb wiped sawdust from his hands on his work pants. They're not ready. Miles looked at him with the steady patience of a man who has seen many things described as not ready. Ready as a moving target, he said. The work doesn't get better from being hidden. It gets better from being seen, from the kind of looking that tells you what the next 10 pieces need. He left. Caleb stood in the barn doorway and watched the pickup truck back down the lane. Then he went back inside, switched off the work light, and sat on a stool in the near dark for a while looking at the shelves. 3 weeks later, Miles called Raymond directly. There was a craft fair in Asheville, the Mountain Heritage event, held annually on the fairgrounds, drawing woodworkers and blacksmiths and makers of all kinds from across western North Carolina. He had reserved a display table and was giving it to Caleb instead. He was not asking. Raymond sat at the kitchen table that evening with the phone face down in front of him. He looked at his son across the remains of dinner. Miles says you should show your work. I know. You don't have to. Caleb looked at the window where the Blue Ridge ridgeline was going dark against the early autumn sky. Yes, I do, he said in the quiet tone that meant the decision had already been made. The morning of the Mountain Heritage Craft Fair was cool and overcast, the mountains pulling in weather from the northwest, the way they do in October, the air carrying the particular clarity of a sky that might or might not hold rain before afternoon. Caleb loaded the truck with crates he'd built himself from pine scraps, each sculpture wrapped in moving blankets he'd found in the barn. Raymond drove. Neither of them talked much on the way in, which was normal for them. Two people who had learned to share silence without making it uncomfortable. The fairgrounds were already busy when they arrived. Established vendors with professional setups occupied the prime positions. Woodworkers with gleaming hand-planed furniture, blacksmiths with intricate ironwork potters with precisely glazed surfaces that caught the flat morning light. Their booths had branded banners, business cards, and small acrylic stands, price sheets laminated and propped at eye level. Everything about their presentations communicated experience systems, the reliable functioning of an operation that had been running for years. Caleb's table sat between a man selling hand-turned bowls from a matching set of display stands and a woodworker named Harold Swick, whose booth occupied twice the standard footprint and displayed pieces that commanded immediate attention: a rocking chair in figured walnut, a side table with dovetail joints so precise they looked machined, a wall cabinet with hand-carved panel details that showed 15 years of dedicated practice in every line. Harold was 58, heavyset, with a gray beard trimmed to a point and the particular self-possession of a craftsman who has competed in shows long enough to stop being nervous about them. He looked at Caleb's table as it was being set up with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was in the same neighborhood. The morning passed slowly. Visitors moved through the fair with the absorbed, browsing quality of people who were enjoying themselves without being in any particular hurry to commit to a purchase. Many stopped at Harold's booth. A few stopped at the bowls. Several people past Caleb's table slowed at the Godzilla sculpture that he'd placed at the center as the focal piece. Only the rough-shaped head and upper body finished the scales along the back still penciled outlines and kept walking. Children were different. Children stopped. Children stared. A girl of about 8 stood in front of Spider-Man for 90 seconds, without moving her eyes, tracking the figure from the pose of the legs up through the swing of the arms to the grain of the ash that made the whole thing look like it was still in motion. Then her father took her hand and moved her along toward Harold's rocking chair, which he examined with the approving nod of a man calculating whether it would look good in a living room he could picture. By mid-afternoon, Caleb had not sold a single piece. He was beginning to pack the smaller sculptures back into their crates when Harold Swick said something that carried across the narrow aisle between their booths, said it at a volume that did not suggest any particular desire to keep it private, said it to the man standing at his booth examining the dovetail table. Superhero toys. Harold's voice had the unhurried certainty of a man delivering a verdict he considered obvious. Kids got talent, I'll give them that. But toys are toys. You want to call yourself a craftsman, you make furniture. You make something a person can use. Carve a character from a movie, and you're still just a kid playing in the garage. The man at Harold's booth laughed a short, uncomfortable laugh and studied the dovetail table with renewed interest. Raymond, who was crouching beside a crate, rose slowly to his full height. His hands at his sides were very still. He looked at Harold Swick's profile for a moment, the look of a man deciding something, and then looked away at the middle distance, with the jaw-set expression of someone who has decided that the thing requiring decision is best left undecided. Caleb did not look at Harold. He was looking at the maple block in the crate in front of him, the rough-shaped Godzilla head with its incomplete scales, and he kept looking at it while he folded the moving blanket around it with careful, methodical movements. The blanket went around the maple. The maple went into the crate. The lid went on the crate. There was nothing to say. Not because there wasn't anything true to say, but because truth would not have improved the situation. And Caleb had learned early that some conversations end before they begin. He had learned this the way he had learned grain direction, through contact with material that would not yield no matter how much force you applied to it, and understanding eventually that the solution was to change direction rather than to keep pushing. They loaded the truck in the failing afternoon light. The fairground was thinning vendors beginning the familiar end-of-day pack-down, and the sky had gone from overcast to the deeper gray of early evening, the mountain ridge line to the west smudged against it. Raymond carried the heaviest crate to the truck without being asked. He set it in the bed and braced it with the same careful precision he brought to everything physical. And then he put both hands flat on the truck bed and stood there for a moment with his back to Caleb. And Caleb understood that his father was managing something that required managing before he turned around. Raymond turned around. His face had settled back into its ordinary expression, which was not as unreadable as most people assumed. One slow day is information, he said. It's not a sentence. Caleb nodded. He believed this partly. He wanted to believe it more completely than he did at that moment, standing in a fairground, with an unsold Godzilla in a crate and Harold Swick's voice still present in the air. He was carrying the last crate to the truck when he heard footsteps behind him. Not the brisk footsteps of someone with a destination, but the slower considering footsteps of someone who has just stopped to look at something. He set the crate down on the tailgate and turned. She was somewhere in her late 20s, tall, with auburn hair pulled back from a face that had a particular quality of watchfulness, not nervousness, something more deliberate, the expression of someone who has taught themselves to observe before drawing conclusions. She wore a camera bag over one shoulder and carried a small tripod folded under her arm. She was not looking at the crate. She was looking at him. "You made the sculptures." Her voice was even the slight edge of a Nashville accent worn down by time and travel. "The ones on that table." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Then what are you working on now?" He had been about to say nothing, meaning that he was done for the day, packing up going home. Instead, he looked at the crate he'd just set on the tailgate. He reached in past the moving blanket and found the edge of the flame-patterned maple block, the one he'd pulled from the Tuesday delivery 3 weeks ago. The one with a natural curve along its base that suggested the way a massive body might be built for impact, rather than speed. The penciled scale outline still covering the back and tail where the detail work hadn't started yet. He lifted it out and held it in the truck's tailgate light. The flame pattern in the maple caught even that inadequate illumination and threw it back in swirling lines that looked like something alive just beneath the surface. Savannah Cole looked at the block for a long moment. She looked at the penciled lines. She looked at the parts already shaped the musculature along the upper body, the weight in the jaw. "Would you let me film you working on it?" Caleb looked at Raymond, who was watching from the driver's side of the truck, with the patient expression of a man who understood that something was happening that did not require his input yet. "Why?" Caleb asked. Savannah shifted the tripod under her arm. "Because I've spent 4 years looking for things worth filming," she said. "I know what that looks like when I find it." She paused. "And because the man 3 booths down spent 10 minutes telling everyone within earshot that what you do isn't real craftsmanship, and everything on your table said he was wrong." The mountain sky had gone fully dark at the edges, the fairground lights warming the immediate air around them into something almost amber. Somewhere across the ground, someone was playing a fiddle, the sound thinning and strengthening with the wind direction. Caleb set the maple block back in the crate. He folded the blanket around it with care. "Tomorrow evening," he said. 6 o'clock. I'll be in the barn." Savannah Cole set up her tripod without ceremony, angling the camera so the work light fell across the maple block from the left, the way natural light enters a north-facing window in late afternoon. She did not ask Caleb to position himself differently. She did not request that he explain what he was doing before he did it. She simply pressed record step back and became the kind of presence in a room that registers without intruding the particular skill of someone who has learned that the moment you ask a subject to perform, you lose the thing you came to capture. Caleb picked up his roughing gouge and went back to work. For the first 40 minutes, he forgot the camera was there. That was not unusual for him. The barn had always operated on its own temporal logic, the hours inside it moving at a different rate than the hours outside, compressed when the work was going well, stretched almost unbearably when it wasn't. The flame-patterned maple block presented a specific challenge he'd been thinking about for 3 weeks. The tail. Godzilla's tail needed to communicate mass without becoming a structural liability. Carving it fully extended would risk fracture at the attachment point. Shortening it would destroy the silhouette. He'd sketched 11 solutions in his notebook without committing to any of them, and now with the gouge in his hand, he found the 12th solution in the grain itself, a slight natural curve in the maple's lower section that would allow the tail to sweep downward rather than extend horizontally, shifting the weight distribution in a way that solved the structural problem without compromising the form. He worked for 3 hours. Savannah filmed. Neither of them spoke much, and when they did, it was in the abbreviated language of 2 people sharing a space with a third thing, the work that required most of the available attention. She asked once about the grain choice in the lower body. He answered in the same way he'd answered Miles Drummond's questions, tracing backward from the decision to the reasoning beneath it, finding that the reasoning was always there, always had been, just waiting for a question to make it visible. When he finally set the gouge down, his back ached in the particular way it did after hours of sustained concentration, not from physical strain, but from the tension of holding the body still while the hands moved with precision. Savannah stopped recording. She looked at the block for a long moment. "I'll edit this week," she told him. "I'll send you a link before I post anything." She did. The video was 9 minutes and 40 seconds long. It began with the exterior of the barn at dusk, the Harper property behind it, the timber pile visible in the background, and Savannah's voice over the image. A 15-year-old in Asheville, North Carolina, is turning wood that a lumber company threw away into something no one expected. Then it cut to Caleb's hands, the gouge moving across the maple, the curls of wood falling away from the tool in slow, deliberate strokes. It did not use music that told the viewer how to feel. It let the sounds of the workshop carry the atmosphere, the scrape of steel against hardwood, the occasional soft sound of sandpaper, once a brief exhale when a cut went exactly where it needed to go. The only interview footage was 30 seconds near the end. Caleb looking at the camera with the direct, unperformed attention that he brought to everything, saying, "The wood already knows what it wants to be. You just have to be patient enough to listen." He watched it on Raymond's laptop at the kitchen table. Raymond watched it beside him. Neither of them said anything when it ended. Raymond closed the laptop. "It's good," Raymond said finally, meaning the video, meaning also the work. Meaning also in the compressed emotional vocabulary they shared something larger that he didn't have exact words for. Savannah posted the video on a Thursday evening under the title, "The 15-year-old Turning Scrap Wood into Legends." By Friday morning, the view count had crossed 12,000. By Saturday night, it had crossed 80,000. By the following Tuesday, the same Tuesday that Gus Tanner's truck appeared at the end of the lane, Raymond's phone had received 47 messages from numbers he didn't recognize. The view count kept moving. Comments appeared faster than Raymond could read them. People from Georgia, from Ohio, from Montana, from states that had no particular relationship to North Carolina, or wood carving, or Appalachian craft traditions, writing to say that watching Caleb work had made them feel something they didn't have a clean word for. Collectors asked about the Venom head. A man in Colorado wanted to know whether the Spider-Man figure was available for purchase. 3 separate messages requested a quote on a life-size Godzilla head for residential installation, which was a commission that would have required a different workshop entirely, but the asking of it said something about what people believed this 15-year-old boy was capable of. Caleb read every message. He answered almost none of them. The gap between what people were asking for and what he was currently equipped to deliver was significant, and he understood that closing that gap was more important than maintaining the correspondence. He pulled out the notebook Raymond had set on the workbench months ago and began for the first time organizing the requests into categories. Commissions with specific subjects. General interest in purchasing existing work. Media inquiries. The notebook filled 3 pages before he stopped counting. The response was not uniform. A popular craft industry newsletter shared the video with a caption that read, "Cute hobby, let's see where it goes." Several comments beneath the video were less generous. One recurring argument held that carving pop culture characters rather than original forms was inherently derivative work, technically impressive, but artistically limited the difference between a skilled copyist and a genuine creative. Another line of criticism focused on the raw materials. Anyone can make something interesting if they start with figured maple, wrote someone whose username suggested expertise. The critique was factually wrong since most of the collection used material that professional woodworkers would have rejected without consideration. But it circulated with the confidence that wrong things often carry on the internet. Caleb read these comments too. He spent less time on them than on the positive messages, not because they didn't register, but because they didn't contain information he could use. Criticism that identified a specific technical failure was useful. Criticism that argued about the category of the work was not something he could address with a chisel. What he could not set aside was the timing. 3 days after the video crossed 200,000 views, Raymond came home from a 10-hour shift to find that the section of the roof above the kitchen had developed a leak that hadn't been there that morning. The rain that week had been heavier than forecast, driven by a system moving up from the Gulf that brought the kind of sustained downpour Western North Carolina sees in late October. The rain that tests old roofing and reveals all the places where previous maintenance had been approximate rather than exact. Raymond stood in the kitchen looking at the water stains spreading across the ceiling with the expression of a man calculating something he doesn't want to calculate. The roof had needed attention for 2 years. Raymond had known it. He'd patched the most obvious vulnerabilities himself during a dry weekend the previous spring. But patching was not replacing, and the estimate he'd gotten from a roofing contractor had been nearly $9,000, which was not money the household had spare. He had been managing the situation by managing his awareness of it, not ignoring it exactly, but placing it in a category of problems that would have to wait for conditions to change. Conditions had not changed. The water came through the kitchen ceiling in a thin, consistent drip that Raymond caught in a pasta pot, and the sound of water hitting aluminum at irregular intervals became the acoustic backdrop of the house for the following week. Conrad Voss called Raymond's cell phone on a Wednesday. His voice was the kind of voice that assumes it will be listened to. Not aggressive, nothing so crude as that, but weighted with the quiet authority of someone who has spent decades operating in rooms where people deferred to him before he gave them a reason to. He introduced himself as a private collector with significant holdings in American craft and folk art, currently based in New York, and he had seen the video. He had done some research. He wanted to meet. Raymond mentioned this to Caleb that evening in the barn, standing in the doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets. Caleb kept working. When he's flying down Saturday. The pasta pot dripped in the kitchen behind the house. Caleb took a fine chisel to a detail in the maple and kept his eyes on the grain. Conrad Voss arrived on Saturday in a rental car that was several grades above what the Asheville airport typically supplied, suggesting the kind of upgrade that happens when someone is recognized at the counter rather than asking for one. He was 54 with dark hair gone silver at both temples, dressed in the specific way of men who want to appear understated while spending significant money doing so. His handshake was practiced, his eye contact calibrated. He spent 45 minutes in the barn asking questions about technique and process, complementing specific pieces with the precision of someone who had done his research rather than improvising. Then he sat down at the kitchen table with Raymond, opened a leather portfolio, and placed a document on the table. The number on the first page was large enough that Raymond's jaw tightened slightly before he could control the reaction. The offer covered the entire existing collection, every finished piece in the barn, plus a long-term exclusivity agreement running 18 months with options to extend. Conrad's operational language was smooth, the friction points embedded in terminology that moved quickly past them. Delivery timelines, quality specifications, material standards, creative approval protocol. That last phrase, creative approval protocol. Raymond read it twice, then looked up. Conrad was looking at the middle distance with the relaxed expression of someone who has already concluded that the deal is done. What does approval protocol mean exactly? Raymond's voice was level. Conrad explained. Every new design would be submitted to his team before carving began. Material selection would require sign-off. He had relationships with premium hardwood suppliers who could provide figured maple and black walnut of consistent quality, which would allow him to accurately represent the work to the collector market. The reclaimed timber arrangement with Blue Ridge would naturally need to end. Variable material produced variable results, and his buyers expected consistency. This was not a criticism of the current approach. It was simply how the market operated at the level Conrad was describing. Caleb was reading this document. He had been quiet since Conrad sat down reading with the same focused attention he brought to grain direction, following each clause to where it actually led, rather than where it announced it was going. The Creative Approval Protocol clause was on page 4. Below it, clause 7.3 established that any design rejected by Conrad's team could not be produced for sale through any other channel during the exclusivity period. He set the document on the table. Conrad was watching him now with the particular attention of someone who has identified where the real negotiation is. The reclaimed wood stays, Caleb said. His voice was even without heat. The designs are mine. If that changes, there's nothing here worth buying. Conrad's expression did not shift in any obvious way, but something in his posture recalibrated a slight adjustment, the way a very experienced chess player registers a move that was better than expected without showing that they registered it. He looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at the pasta pot, catching drips in the kitchen behind them. He looked at his son. Then he pushed the leather portfolio back across the table toward Conrad with a quiet, deliberate motion. Conrad gathered the portfolio without visible irritation, which was itself a kind of signal. The irritation was there, it was simply operating at a frequency he had learned to conceal. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. The market has a way of clarifying values. He said the sentence balanced perfectly between genuine advice and a veiled threat. He left. His rental car backed down the gravel lane with the unhurried precision of a man who was not done. The dripping in the kitchen continued. Raymond stood at the kitchen window looking out at nothing in particular. The late October light came through the glass at a low angle, catching the dust motes in the air, making them visible. I'm going to figure out the roof, Caleb said. Raymond turned from the window. He looked at his son in the way of a parent who understands that his child has crossed into territory that requires its own kind of navigation. I know you are, he said. The Blue Ridge timber delivery. The following Tuesday did not come. Gus Tanner's truck appeared at the end of the lane, at the usual hour, rumbled up the gravel in the usual way, but when it came to a stop, the flatbed was empty. Gus climbed down from the cab with his cap already in his hands, which was a posture Caleb had never seen from him in all the Tuesday mornings they'd done this. Gus was a man who wore his hat until he was indoors. The hat in the hands meant something. "I'm sorry, son." His southern accent made the sentence move at a different pace than apology usually moved. Company sold that allocation. The figured maple, the black walnut blocks, the twisted oak, the whole premium lot. Sold it to a buyer in New York. Management decision came down Monday. I loaded what I loaded, and it wasn't what I expected to load. He turned his cap in his hands once. "There'll be standard material next week, maybe. I just don't know what standard means anymore after this." Caleb looked at the empty flatbed. Then he looked at the corner of the property where the timber pile usually accumulated the irregular stack of ambitious material that formed the raw inventory of everything he had planned to make between now and spring. The corner held what remained from previous delivery sections he'd already evaluated. Nothing with the character of the flame-patterned maple or the dense-figured walnut that had been coming in increasing quantities as Blue Ridge workers learned to set aside the unusual pieces. Gus put his cap back on. He looked genuinely troubled in the way of a man who understands he's been made an instrument of something without having agreed to be. "Whoever bought it paid twice what they'd get from us normally," he said. "I've been driving this route for 8 years. Never seen that before." After the truck left, Caleb stood in the empty corner of the property for a long time. The wind came off the ridge with the cold edge that arrives in late October and doesn't leave until April, and the field grass had gone the pale straw color it goes when the growing season is finished. No material meant no new sculptures. No sculptures meant no commissions. The notebook with 3 full pages of customer requests sat on the workbench in the barn, and every name in it had a timeline attached to the request, and those timelines were based on a supply of material that had just been systematically removed. He understood what had happened. The understanding arrived without drama, simply the recognition of a sequence Conrad Voss had made, and the offer had been refused. Conrad Voss had located the point of vulnerability in the system that supported Caleb's work, and he had applied pressure there. It was efficient, almost elegant in a cold way, the kind of move that only works when someone has correctly identified what matters most to you. What mattered most to Caleb was the work. The work required material. The material had come from a source that could be redirected by someone with enough capital to make the redirection straightforward. He went inside. He ate dinner. He did his homework. After Raymond had gone to bed, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a county map he'd found in the truck's glove box, a paper map the kind gas stations used to sell covering a 40-mile radius from Asheville in his notebook. He wrote down the names of every small-scale sawmill and timber operation he could find from online searches cross-referenced against the county map and circled everyone within reasonable cycling distance. There were 11. He couldn't know without calling or visiting which of them had the kind of secondary material he needed. The irregular cuts, the rejected sections, the timber that failed commercial grading for reasons that had nothing to do with its actual quality. He went to bed. He set his alarm for 5:30. The first mill he visited was 7 miles south, run by 2 brothers who produced dimensional lumber for residential construction. They were polite. They had nothing he could use. Their waste stream was chips and sawdust, no dimensional rejects. The second was 8 miles east, a larger operation that supplied flooring stock to a regional distributor. The woman at the front office listened to his explanation with genuine interest, but their irregular cuts were already committed to a wood pellet company on a standing contract. The third was across a ridge 12 miles on roads that climbed through a section of the National Forest before descending to a small valley operation that had been running since the 1940s. The owner was not interested in a conversation with a teenager on a bicycle, which he communicated with efficiency. It was 20 miles into the day's riding with the afternoon going cold, and the light losing its authority over the landscape that Caleb came over a rise and saw the Blevins Mill sign at the bottom of the grade, white letters on green metal. The paint faded but legible, the driveway lined with stacked log sections waiting for the mill saw. He'd seen the name in Raymond's records, a source from years back when Raymond had bought some rough-cut oak for a fence repair. The entry in Raymond's accounts was old. There was no guarantee anyone was still operating there. Warren Blevins was 67, a compact man with rough, weathered hands, a white mustache that he'd had since it was brown, and the watchful patience of someone who had been running a small independent operation long enough to have outlasted everything that was supposed to put him out of business. He was inspecting a log section when Caleb came down the driveway and seemed unsurprised to find a boy on a bicycle in his yard in the late afternoon. The way people who've been in business for decades become unsurprised by almost anything, Caleb explained. He was specific and brief, what he made, what material he needed, what Blue Ridge had been providing, why that arrangement had ended. He didn't editorialize about Conrad Voss. He simply described the supply gap and what would fill it. Warren listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, he said, "Show me." Caleb pulled up Savannah's video on his phone. The screen was small in the outdoor light, but Warren leaned in and watched the full 9 minutes without looking away. He watched the gouge moving across the maple. He watched the scale detail accumulating in slow, patient increments. He watched the 30-second interview clip at the end, Caleb saying the thing about the wood knowing what it wants to become. Warren straightened up. He looked around his yard with the expression of a man doing a specific kind of accounting. "I've got cherry that's split wrong coming out of the log. Got some walnut with mineral stain that wouldn't move as flooring. Got a section of figured sycamore that's been sitting in the shed for 3 years because I didn't know what to do with it." He paused. "I won't give it away, but I won't charge you what it's worth either, because to me right now it's not worth much." Caleb felt something settle in his chest that had been braced since Tuesday morning. "I can pay with the first commission check." Warren considered this for a moment with the unhurried pace of a man for whom handshakes still constituted contracts. "Then we have a deal." He put his hand out. The ride home was 14 miles in the dark, the road losing its color before Caleb reached the county highway, the temperature dropping through the 30s with the wind coming off the higher elevations. He rode in the reflective gear he'd had the foresight to pack, and he thought about the figured sycamore sitting in Warren Blevins' shed for 3 years waiting without knowing it was waiting. He thought about the mineral-stained walnut, which would produce surfaces that standard woodworkers would avoid because the coloration was unpredictable. He thought about what unpredictable coloration looked like when you let it become part of the design rather than a problem to root around. The farmhouse windows were lit when he came up the lane. Raymond was still awake, which was unusual for a night before a long shift. He was sitting at the kitchen table when Caleb came through the door, still in his work jacket, with a mug of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. Caleb hung his cycling gear on the hook by the door. He sat down across from his father. Raymond looked at him at the cold, reddened face, the road grime, the expression of someone who has gone a considerable distance to accomplish a specific thing. He got up. He came back with a mug of coffee that was not cold, set it on the table in front of Caleb, and sat back down. "Blevins Mill," Caleb said. 14 miles. He's got walnut cherry figured sycamore. We have a deal." Raymond looked at his son across the kitchen table. Outside, the wind worked at the corner of the roof where the flashing had lifted, making the small sound it had been making for weeks. Raymond had learned to hear it without reacting. Now he let himself hear it properly, the actual sound of a problem that was still unsolved, still present, still his responsibility. He nodded once. The nod was not small. It carried the weight of everything he hadn't said in the kitchen that afternoon when Conrad Voss pushed his portfolio back across the table, everything he couldn't say in the fairground parking lot when Harold Swick's voice had carried across the aisle. It carried the particular pride of a father who has watched his son ride 40 miles in the cold to solve a problem that a grown man with full resources tried to make permanent, and who has watched his son return with the problem solved. He didn't say any of that. He drank his coffee. Caleb drank his coffee. The roof made its sound in the wind. 3 days later, an email arrived for Caleb through the contact form Savannah had set up on a simple website she'd built after the video. The sender was Nora Whitfield, writing from a Charlotte address on a domain that resolved to an interior design firm specializing in high-end mountain residential properties. She had seen the video. She had been following the comments, including the ones from Savannah's subsequent post, explaining that the original timber supply had been disrupted by an outside buyer. She wrote without apparent sympathy for the situation and without the elaborate complimenting that preceded most of the messages Caleb received. She wrote the way people write when they have decided something and are communicating the decision rather than building toward it. She needed 6 significant pieces for a mountain lodge project opening in late spring. The lodge was privately owned, designed as a permanent primary residence rather than a rental or hospitality property, and the client wanted interior focal points that were, in her exact words, irreplaceable. She understood the timeline implications of significant hand-carved work. She had budgeted accordingly. She would send the full brief upon receiving confirmation of interest, but she wanted to be clear about one thing before anything else. She had read the reporting about the supply situation, she understood what it meant, and her brief was built around the reclaimed material approach, not despite it. If Caleb wanted to switch to premium uniform lumber to fulfill her commission, she was not the right client. If he wanted to work exactly as he had been working, sourcing material based on its character rather than its consistency, designing around what the wood offered rather than forcing the wood into what he designed, she would wait as long as the work required. Caleb read the email twice. He looked at the contact information at the bottom. He looked at the amount she'd mentioned in passing the budget figure, which she had included without apparent consciousness of what it meant for a household with a dripping ceiling. He looked out the kitchen window at the first snow of the season, which had arrived overnight and was sitting on the Blue Ridge ridgeline in a thin white line against the gray morning sky. He typed a 2-sentence reply. "I'm interested. Please send the brief." He pressed send. He went to the barn. He picked up the figured sycamore section that Warren Blevins had delivered the previous afternoon, set it on the workbench under the work light, put both hands flat against its surface, and closed his eyes. Somewhere in this pale, mineral-marked wood, something was already waiting. He just needed to be patient enough to find it. Winter came down from the Blue Ridge with the particular authority it carries in the southern Appalachians. Not the dramatic blizzard variety of higher latitudes, but a sustained, gray-boned cold that settled into the valleys and stayed. The farmhouse roof got fixed in the first week of December. Raymond arranged it himself, calling in a favor from a man he'd worked alongside for years, whose cousin ran a roofing crew operating between jobs. The cost was below the $9,000 estimate. It was still more than they had easily available, but Caleb had transferred half of Nora Whitfield's deposit into the household account the same afternoon it arrived, without discussion, setting it on the kitchen table as a printed transaction confirmation, the way Raymond used to set woodworking magazines there. Raymond looked at the paper for a long time before folding it and putting it in his shirt pocket. The roofing crew worked 2 days. On the second morning, Caleb stood in the barn doorway listening to the sound of new material being laid across the frame above the kitchen, the rhythmic nail gun percussion carrying through the cold air, and understood that something structural had changed, not just in the building, but in the household's relationship to its own fragility. The leak had represented a specific kind of pressure, the kind that accumulates silently until it becomes undeniable. Its repair did not eliminate pressure. It simply removed one variety of it, freeing attention for everything else. He had 5 pieces committed to Nora Whitfield's brief with a 6th design still unresolved. The brief had been detailed in a way he hadn't expected from a first client. Not dictatorial. Nothing that constrained his approach, but precise about the lodge's interior architecture. The sight lines from specific rooms, the way natural light moved through the space at different hours. Nora had sent photographs, floor plans, material samples. She understood that context shaped the reception of art, the way light shapes the reading of grain. And she wanted him to understand the context before he began. He'd spent a week with the brief before touching the Blevins Mill material, studying the photographs, the way he studied wood, looking for what the space was already asking for, rather than deciding what he wanted to put into it. The sycamore had resolved itself into the largest piece of dragon, not the fantasy variety he'd made in his earlier years, but something that existed in the particular register between mythology and natural history, a creature that looked as though it might have been discovered rather than invented. The mineral staining in the sycamore created surface patterns that no paint or dye could have produced. Deep gray-green variations moving through the pale base wood in formations that suggested scales without requiring him to carve every individual one. He carved the ones that mattered along the spine, across the shoulders, at the joints of the wings, letting the natural coloration carry the narrative elsewhere. The effect was of something ancient partially revealed the way a fossil looks when it's been half excavated. He worked through December with a consistency that impressed even Raymond, who was not easily impressed by consistency since he practiced it himself as a matter of survival. 5:30 alarm, school, homework at the kitchen table immediately after returning home, finished before dinner without exception. Then the barn, the work light, the cold that seeped through the barn's improved but not perfect insulation. Until 9 or 10 when the precision his hands required began to degrade with fatigue. He had learned early that tired hands make decisions that rested. Hands spend hours correcting, so he stopped when he felt that threshold approaching when to bed started again. Nora visited in mid-January, driving up from Charlotte on a Tuesday when school was out for a teacher development day. She arrived without the entourage that her professional success might have justified, just herself, in practical boots suitable for walking construction sites with a measuring tape clipped to her jacket and the unhurried attention of someone who looks at rooms for a living. She spent 2 hours in the barn, moving from piece to piece with the measuring tape occasionally extended, but mostly just looking the way you look when the measurements are almost secondary to the quality of presence a thing has in a space. She stopped longest before the sycamore dragon. She walked around it 3 times, crouching once to examine the point where the mineral staining ran through the wing membrane, creating a gradient that shifted from near black at the leading edge to the pale natural wood color at the trailing. She straightened up. She looked at Caleb, who was at the workbench working on the 5th commission piece, a walnut figure for the lodge's main stairwell landing. "You made a decision here." Her voice was professional, precise. "The staining, you let it run through the wing rather than avoiding it in the material selection." "I built the wing around where the staining ran," Caleb said. "The staining decided where the wing went." Nora was quiet for a moment with the expression of someone integrating information that confirms something they'd theorized but not verified. "That's the difference," she said, not quite to him, more to herself or to the room, "between someone who works with material and someone who works against it." She confirmed the 6th piece that afternoon, a commission she'd been uncertain about until she saw the sycamore. She wanted something for the lodge's entrance hall, the first thing a visitor encountered coming through the door, something that established the character of everything that followed. She described the space stone floor, 20-foot ceiling, a single large north-facing window. She didn't specify what the piece should be. She said, "Make what the entrance hall is asking for." Then she drove back to Charlotte. Caleb stood in the barn doorway after her car left and thought about 20-foot ceilings. He thought about north light, which is the most consistent light, the light that doesn't shift with the hour, the way south light does, the light that shows things as they are, rather than as the angle of illumination makes them appear. He went to the remaining pile of Blevins Mill material and stood in front of a black walnut section he'd been circling for weeks without committing to nearly 4 feet in its longest dimension, with a grain pattern that moved in long opposing diagonals, the kind of tension in the material that made most woodworkers nervous. He had been nervous about it too. Now he understood what the nervousness had been pointing toward. He began sketching that evening. The 6th piece took 11 weeks. It was the most technically demanding thing he had attempted, requiring him to develop 2 new techniques for managing the opposing grain tensions without letting either side fracture during the carving of the deepest details. He broke 3 gouges. He redesigned the lower section twice. There were 4 evenings when he sat on his stool and looked at the work in progress and felt the specific despair of a project that seems to be moving away from the original vision rather than toward it. The fear that the gap between what you imagined and what the material is producing might be unclosable. Each time he went to bed, each time returning the next evening with rested hands and eyes that had stopped trying to force the resolution, he found a path that the previous night's frustration had obscured. The finished piece was not what he had sketched. It was better than what he had sketched in the way that the venom tongue had been better broken than whole, because the material had contributed to the design rather than simply receiving it. What emerged from the walnut was a figure that existed in the moment just before motion, every line of the form implying direction, without yet committing to it. The opposing grain tensions, rather than being resolved or hidden, were visible in the finished surface as a kind of visual argument. The wood's own history made part of the work's meaning. He photographed it himself using the natural light through the barn's north-facing window on a clear February morning. He sent the photographs to Nora. Her reply came 40 minutes later, a single sentence. This is the first thing anyone will see. Spring arrived gradually, the way it does at elevation, tentative, and then sudden, the ridgeline going from bare gray to the particular pale green of new growth over the course of 2 weeks in late March. The barn had been reorganized during the winter months, not renovated in any expensive sense, but reconfigured with the purposeful arrangement of a space that was no longer a place where a boy carved in his spare time, but a place where serious work was made. Raymond had built additional shelving along the south wall using oak planks from a section that had been in the timber pile since summer. He'd rehung the work light on a track that allowed it to be repositioned, understanding from watching his son work that fixed light creates fixed blind spots. A second smaller workbench occupied the east corner for detail work requiring a different height and angle than the main bench. Above the barn door, Raymond had spent one Saturday afternoon with a mallet and a wide chisel in a piece of maple plank that had been sitting in the corner since the first Blue Ridge delivery. He didn't tell Caleb what he was doing. He didn't ask for help. He worked with the slow, deliberate concentration of a man performing a task that matters to him in ways he's not prepared to articulate. When Caleb came out after finishing homework to find his father climbing down from a stepladder, the maple plank was installed above the doorway with 4 letters carved into it in the deep, clean serif style of someone who has spent decades reading technical specifications and understands the relationship between precision of mark and legibility of meaning. Harper Wood Art Studio. Raymond had added one element that hadn't been discussed below the name in smaller letters, a date. The year Caleb had started carving. Not this year, not the year of the video or the commissions, or any of the events that the outside world might consider the beginning. The year Caleb had found his grandfather's pocket knife in a drawer and taken it to a fallen branch in the property's edge and come back with something that looked almost nothing like a bird. They stood outside together in the late afternoon light looking at the sign. The Blue Ridge ridgeline was visible beyond the property's tree line, still carrying a little snow in the high north-facing notches. Neither of them spoke for a long time, which was not silence between them, but the kind of full quiet that only exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to name it. Raymond put his hand briefly on the back of Caleb's neck, the way he used to do when Caleb was small enough that the gesture covered most of his head. Then he went inside to start dinner. The deliveries had resumed. Blue Ridge Timber's arrangement with Conrad Voss had apparently been a one-time transaction rather than an ongoing relationship. Or perhaps the premium prices Conrad had paid for the unusual material were not on reflection a sustainable approach to a business objective that had already failed. Gus Tanner reappeared on a Tuesday in late February with an apologetic manner and a flatbed carrying 3 sections of curly maple that were among the most visually striking pieces Caleb had seen come off that truck. The Blue Ridge workers had apparently reorganized their approach to what qualified as waste. Material that grain-checked at the wrong angle for flooring, burled sections too dense for clean dimensional cutting. Naturally forked trunks that the mill couldn't process at all. These began arriving with the consistency of a deliberate selection rather than the randomness of overflow. Everett Pruitt came to the barn on a Saturday afternoon in April unannounced with his granddaughter, a serious-faced girl of about 10 named Delia, who had apparently seen Savannah's video on a school tablet and asked to visit with an insistence that Everett, despite his general skepticism about most things, had found impossible to redirect. He walked through the studio the way a man walks through a space that is confounding his existing categories, moving slowly, looking at things longer than he normally looked at things. He stopped before the Godzilla figure in flame-patterned maple, the one Caleb had photographed for Savannah's video, now fully finished with every scale carved the tail, sweeping downward in the curve that the maple's natural grain had suggested back in October. The afternoon light was coming through the western window at an angle that caught the figure's surface and made the flame pattern in the maple seem to move. Everett took his cap off. It was the same gesture Caleb had watched countless people make in front of work that exceeded what they'd prepared themselves to encounter. It was involuntary. It happened before thought. "I owe you a specific apology," Everett said. His voice had lost its usual declarative authority. "I drove past your property every week for 2 years and I told my wife you were collecting junk. I told the Hendersons the same thing. I told anyone who asked." He turned the cap in his hands once. "I was wrong about what I was looking at. Caleb looked at Everett Pruitt, the 71-year-old man who had been wrong about something with a confidence that only long habit makes possible. He thought about what it cost to stand in a 15-year-old's workshop and say that directly. "You were looking at logs," Caleb said. "They were logs." "They were logs," Everett agreed. "But you were seeing what they could become. That's not the same thing as looking, and I didn't understand the difference until I walked in here." Delia, who had been standing very still in front of Spider-Man, with the focused intensity of a child in the presence of something that has captured her complete attention, looked up at that. She looked at her grandfather. She looked at Caleb. She filed something away behind her serious face, something she would probably carry for a long time without being able to name it precisely the way important things tend to work on people. Harold Swick arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early May, 2 weeks before the lodge opening. He came alone, no announcement, his truck pulling into the lane with a caution that suggested he was uncertain of his reception. He was 58, and in the months since the Mountain Heritage Fair, he had continued selling his furniture and his dovetailed tables to buyers who valued exactly what he offered them, which was technical mastery in service of functional forms. He had not thought about the comment he made at the fair with any particular frequency. Then he had seen the video. Then he had seen the second video Savannah made when the supply chain story broke. Then he had watched several of the short clips that other people had recorded and posted from visits to the studio that Caleb had begun quietly allowing on weekend afternoons. He stood in front of the Sycamore Dragon for a long time. He looked at the walnut piece that would become the lodge entrance hall's first statement. He looked at the shelf of early work, the butter knife knight, the lopsided eagle, the 3 iterations of dragon arranged in the order of their making, each one documenting what the previous had taught. "I want to talk about what I said at the Heritage Fair." Harold began the sentence carrying the uncomfortable weight of someone who has rehearsed an opening and is now living in it. "I want to explain what I meant and why." Caleb shook his head once, not dismissively. "You don't have to explain it." Harold stopped. He looked at the boy, at the 15-year-old, now 16, who had spent the winter solving problems that Harold, with 30 years of professional woodworking experience, wouldn't have known how to approach. "I want to," he said, "because saying what I said was wrong in a way that goes past just being rude about it." Caleb set his current tool down and gave Harold his full attention, the same complete, unperformed attention he gave to grain direction. He waited. Harold looked at the shelf of failures. He looked at it for long enough that the looking was its own statement. "I spent 30 years learning to make furniture that is technically perfect," he said. "Every joint closes without a gap. Every surface is flat to tolerance. I am very good at what I do." He paused. "But you understand something I had to work 30 years to even start to understand, and you came to it by 15. That makes a man say things he shouldn't say." He looked at Caleb directly. "I was wrong, not just impolite, wrong. What you make is craft and it is art, and the reason I called it a toy is because I couldn't immediately explain why it wasn't, and that frightened me more than I want to admit." The barn was quiet. Outside, the spring afternoon was bright enough that the light coming through the windows had the particular quality of a season that has finally committed to its own existence. Caleb picked his tool back up. He looked at the current piece on the workbench, a smaller commission that had come in through the website, a private buyer wanting something from the Dragon series. "The first dragon I made broke in 3 places," he said. "It's on that shelf. I kept it because it taught me more than the ones that worked." Harold looked at the broken first dragon. His expression shifted into something that had more genuine curiosity in it than anything he'd shown since arriving. "Can I ask about the neck joint, how it failed?" They talked about wood for nearly an hour. Not about the video, not about Conrad Voss, not about what Caleb was doing with his career or his future, or any of the subjects that adults usually raise with him, as though they were more urgent than the work itself. They talked about grain direction, about the specific behavior of maple under a skew chisel versus a straight blade, about the hidden tension in material that reveals itself only when you've committed too far to change course, and about the various strategies available for managing rather than avoiding it. Harold knew things Caleb didn't know, and Caleb knew things Harold didn't know, and the conversation operated in the territory where 2 different kinds of understanding meet and produce something neither could have reached alone. Before he left, Harold paused at the door beneath the sign Raymond had carved. He read it. He read the date below the name. "You started carving the year your mother died," he said. "Yes." Harold put his cap on. He nodded once, the nod of a man who understands something he's not going to try to put into words. He went to his truck. He drove out of the lane without looking back, which was, Caleb would think later, the right way to leave after a conversation like that. The lodge opening was a private event held in the second week of May on a property in the mountains west of Asheville that could only be reached by a road that switched back up the mountain through forest that closed in on both sides. Nora Whitfield had been coordinating the installation for 3 weeks, working with the lodge's interior team to position each piece in relationship to the space's light and architecture. Caleb attended with Raymond, both of them in the best clothes they own, which were clean and presentable without being the right register for the gathering, a fact neither of them mentioned. The entrance hall walnut piece was the first thing Caleb saw when he came through the door. It stood in the north light from the large window, the opposing grain tensions visible in the surface, the way they had been in the barn but changed by the scale of the space around it, which gave the implied motion of the form room to complete itself in the viewer's imagination, rather than stopping at the physical boundaries of the work. He stood in the entrance hall for a long time. Raymond stood beside him. A woman he didn't know stopped next to them and looked at the walnut piece with an expression that moved through several stages before arriving at something he could only describe as recognition. Not recognition of the subject matter, but of something the work was saying about the nature of the material. It was made from the way it had been found rather than forced. Conrad Voss was there. He was not the reason Caleb came, but his presence in the room was something Caleb registered from across the space with the same peripheral alertness that tells you when a weather system is changing pressure without yet producing visible clouds. Conrad moved through the gathering with the confident ease of a man at home in expensive rooms, stopping to speak with people who appeared to know him, examining the pieces Nora had placed throughout the lodge with the professional eye of someone who buys and sells this category of object. Caleb did not approach him. He spent the evening talking to the people Nora introduced him to, answering questions about process and material, with the same direct economy he brought to everything. Eating the food that circulated on trays. Watching Raymond talk to a retired contractor from Asheville who had built a few mountain properties of his own and wanted to compare notes about construction in high-elevation terrain. Conrad found him near the end of the evening. He was standing at the window, looking out at the mountain dark, the ridgeline visible as a deeper darkness against the sky, when he heard footsteps that moved with purpose and then stopped nearby. Conrad stood beside him at the window. For a moment, neither of them spoke, looking at the same darkness outside. "I want to tell you something," Conrad said. His voice had lost the calibrated smoothness that had characterized everything he said at the kitchen table in October. What was left was something more straightforwardly human. "I underestimated what I was looking at. Not the work. I correctly valued the work from the beginning. I underestimated what the work required to exist. The specific conditions, the material, the process, the source of it." He paused. "I tried to buy it and separate it from those conditions because that's what I know how to do. I was wrong. Caleb looked at Conrad's profile in the window's reflection. 54 years old, silver at the temples, a man who had spent a career correctly identifying value in things other people hadn't recognized yet. He had correctly identified the value in Caleb's work. He had incorrectly understood what the value was made of. "The wood that comes off Gus Tanner's truck," Caleb said, "is wood that a company decided wasn't good enough. Every piece I've made started as something someone gave up on." He looked back at the mountain dark. "You can't buy that and move it somewhere else. It doesn't work that way." Conrad was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, it doesn't." He looked at the walnut piece in the entrance hall, visible from where they stood. "That piece will appreciate significantly. I want you to know that, not as an offer, just as information." He moved away through the gathering. Caleb watched his reflection in the window glass until it disappeared into the room behind him. Gus Tanner's final delivery came on a Tuesday in late May. Caleb knew it was the last one before Gus retired because Gus had mentioned it 3 weeks earlier in the offhand way of a man who has been looking at the end of something for a long time and learned to refer to it without flinching. 30 years of Tuesday mornings. 30 years of the same diesel engine on the same gravel roads throughout the region, loading and unloading material that became other things in other people's hands and lives. Caleb had been working on the piece for 6 weeks. He'd started it the morning after Gus mentioned retirement using the last significant section from the very first Blue Ridge delivery, a maple block he'd set aside in the early days, without being able to explain why storing it in the driest corner of the barn, checking on it periodically, the way you check on something you're keeping for a reason you haven't identified yet. The maple had dried and settled over the months, its grain stabilizing into a pattern he now understood better than he had when it arrived. Long, clear lines suggesting the horizontal the road, the unrolling of distance. He carved a man in a truck cab, not a heroic figure, nothing elevated above the specific gravity of its subject. A man in his 60s in a work jacket with broad hands resting on a steering wheel, and a posture that suggested not arrival, but the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone in the middle of a long journey. The kind of sustained, unheroic presence required to do the same thing reliably for 30 years. Through weather and physical fatigue, in the ordinary accumulation of a working life's worth of mornings. The face was not a portrait. It was not Gus specifically. It was the expression of someone looking at the road ahead with the patience of a person who has made peace with the distance. He finished it the night before. He drove to the Blue Ridge Depot before sunrise in Raymond's truck, the sculpture wrapped in a moving blanket in the bed. The depot supervisor, a man named Carl, who had been there almost as long as Gus, led him into the yard with a combination of curiosity and respect that the studio's reputation had earned in the months since the video. Caleb placed the wrapped sculpture on the passenger seat of Gus's truck, buckled the seatbelt across it to keep it stable, and left. He was standing at the end of the Hearst property lane when Gus's truck came down the road for the last time. He had a full load. Blue Ridge had given him the final run, a full flatbed of material for various deliveries across the county, so that his last day looked like any other day, which was exactly right. The truck slowed when Gus saw Caleb standing there, pulled to a stop on the road's shoulder. Gus climbed down with the cap already in his hands, which was still unusual. Still meant something. He had already found the sculpture. His eyes were different from how they normally looked when he stepped down from the cab, something in them that was not quite wet, but was in that vicinity, the expression of someone who has been unexpectedly presented with evidence that their ordinary life has mattered in ways they didn't know about. "Carl let you in the yard," Gus said. It was not a question. He did. Gus looked at the moving blanket in his hands. He had carried it down from the cab. He held it the way you hold something you've already opened and then carefully wrapped again. "I sat in the cab for about 10 minutes before I could drive," he said. "Thought I was going to be late on my last day." He almost laughed. "What wood did you use?" Caleb looked at the truck at the road at the May morning coming in clear and bright over the ridgeline. "From the first delivery you made here." Gus was quiet. He looked at the Hearst property, the farmhouse, the barn with its new sign visible above the door, the timber pile in the corner that was the accumulated record of every Tuesday morning he'd driven down this lane. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something when he understands for the first time, and all at once, what it was. "I drove past here twice a week for years," Gus said, his voice carrying the slight roughness of someone managing something internal. "I never once thought about where the wood went." "Nobody did," Caleb said. "That's what made it available." Gus looked at him, at this 16-year-old standing in the morning light on the edge of the property in the too large canvas jacket he'd worn since Gus's first delivery. "You knew what it was before you touched it," Gus said. Caleb thought about the maple block he'd stood beside on the first Tuesday morning, his hand flat against the split surface, the grain moving in those long, sweeping curves that suggested something not yet visible. He thought about every block since then, all the material that had arrived without knowing it was arriving for a purpose, all the Tuesday mornings that had accumulated into a life's first chapter. "The wood knew," he said. "I just listened." Gus put his cap back on. He put his hand out. Caleb shook at the hand of a man who had driven the same roads for 30 years, whose calloused grip was the record of a working life spent in service of other people's projects without knowing the full extent of what those projects were. They held the handshake for a moment longer than handshakes usually last. Then Gus climbed back into the cab, buckled in, and eased the truck back onto the road. Caleb watched the flatbed move down the county highway until it went around the curve, where the tree line closed in, and then it was gone. The morning was bright. A Blue Ridge timber truck, a different truck, a younger driver was already visible at the far end of the road, making its way toward the Hearst property with the week's delivery. Raymond appeared in the farmhouse doorway. He had watched the scene from the porch. He held 2 coffee mugs, and he came down the porch steps and across the property without any particular hurry, the way he did everything, and handed 1 mug to his son. They stood together at the edge of the lane. The new truck came down the road with its load of discarded timber, the rejected, the irregular, the material that the commercial market had determined was not worth incorporating into its systems. It backed through the gap in the fence posts. The hydraulic lift groaned. The logs came down with the same heavy thuds they always had, landing in the corner of the property where every Tuesday's delivery had landed, accumulating in the patient. Indifferent way of material that does not know what it is waiting to become. Caleb wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. He looked at the new pile. Somewhere in that timber, in the hidden grain of the maple, in the tension locked inside the walnut, in whatever the morning light would reveal. When he walked over and put his hands against the surface, the next work was already present. Not waiting exactly. Not patient in the way people are patient with awareness of what patience costs. Simply there, the way truth is there, before anyone has thought to look for it. Available to anyone willing to approach it without deciding in advance what they would find. He finished his coffee. He handed the mug to Raymond. He crossed the field toward the new pile, his boots leaving dark marks in the dew-wet grass. The morning quiet around him, except for the birds in the tree line, reclaiming the silence the truck had briefly interrupted. He reached the nearest log, a maple section, rough bark still on split along one edge to reveal a grain that moved in long diagonals he'd never seen before, and he placed both palms flat against the raw interior surface. He closed his eyes. The wood was cool against his hands. Beneath the bark, beneath the surface, the grain was already going somewhere. It had been going somewhere since the tree began growing before the mill, before the truck, before any of the mornings that had brought it here. His hands found the direction of it, the long, patient logic of the material, and he stood there in the May morning light and listened.